Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. On a bright Monday morning in a quiet Oregon town, a 19-year-old girl vanished in broad daylight. No screams, no struggle, just a mop bucket, and her sandals left behind like an unfinished sentence. 5 years later, what unraveled wasn't just a mystery, it was a lesson in how evil wears no face. Corvallis, Oregon, wasn't a place known for missing persons. It was a college town, modest, safe, slow-moving. Most crimes involved unpaid parking tickets or an occasional bar fight off Monroe Avenue. So when Brooke Wilberger failed to show up for lunch on May 24, 2004, her family didn't panic. Not at first. She had been working that morning, scrubbing lampposts at Oak Park Apartments, a side job arranged by her sister, who lived on the property. Brooke was the type who didn't skip responsibilities. She was on time, polite, anchored in faith. People described her as luminous but not loud. She wasn't the girl who'd just walk off. That much was clear. Around noon, someone noticed the mop bucket still filled with soapy water. A rag hung over the rim. Her sandals, both of them, were off her feet and facing opposite directions on the concrete walkway. That was the first fracture. The Wilberger family called the police shortly after. Officers arrived fast, but the scene didn't give them much. No sign of a fight, no witnesses, no shell casings, no screams had been heard. The last time someone remembered seeing Brooke was just before 10 o'clock a.m. So where did she go? The area was sealed off, though there wasn't much to preserve. A forensic tech from the Benton County Sheriff's Office scanned the walkway for trace evidence, fibers, fluids, impressions. Nothing viable came up. No drag marks, no blood. The sandals looked like they'd been pulled off quickly, but not violently. Just gone. Inside the apartment management office, detectives pulled rental rosters, visitor logs, and tried to figure out who'd been nearby. A few residents said they'd seen a green van parked unusually close that morning, but no license plate. No driver description. Nothing to build from. With the clock ticking, search efforts expanded. Dogs were brought in. A chopper circled the surrounding brush and forest lines. Volunteers canvassed the park and nearby bike paths. Still, not a single thread. At this point, law enforcement followed protocol and treated it as a missing persons case. But the lead detective noted the lack of personal belongings. Brooke's phone, wallet, and car keys had all been left behind. Her purse was untouched in the family home. This didn't fit the profile of someone leaving on their own. The detective later said, if she walked away, she walked barefoot, without her phone, and with a bucket of soapy water mid-shift. That's not leaving, that's being taken. It's often said in forensic circles, the absence of evidence is its own kind of clue. In this case, there was too much absence. No trail, no noise, no object displaced beyond what she was using for work. In the first 24 hours, the FBI was contacted. Not because of jurisdiction, but because of the alarming possibility of a stranger abduction. Statistically rare, but when they happen, they're often resolved in one of two ways, fast or never. Corvallis police made an urgent plea to the public. Local news picked up the story. Brooke's image, clean and composed in her Brigham Young University ID photo, flashed across TV screens and gas station flyers. But there was nothing else to show. No video surveillance existed on the property at that time. Oak Park was built before private security cameras became standard. Detectives began manually canvassing every square block, hoping someone's porch camera or business footage had picked up the van or anything unusual, but the clock was already ticking hard against them. By day 3, every local law enforcement agency was involved. K-9 units traced scent trails that went cold near the street. Dive teams searched retention ponds. Tips trickled in, but most were either baseless or flat-out wrong. Psychic hotlines, false sightings, unverified hunches, it became white noise. And yet, investigators didn't close the case. Because something about the scene stayed with them, that pair of sandals. They weren't tossed. They weren't abandoned in a panic. They looked almost placed, one slightly overlapping the other, like a switch had been flipped, from routine to gone. By the end of that week, there were over 2,000 leads logged, many overlapping, many empty. But one kept re-emerging from different people at different times, a green Dodge Caravan. No one saw who was driving it. No one remembered it pulling in or pulling out. But 3 separate residents remembered that color and that make, just not the tag. Could it be the key? Or just the town turning a vehicle into a symbol? The first 72 hours of a missing person investigation define everything. They are either the runway to resolution or a cliff no one can climb back from. In the case of Brooke Wilberger, the first 72 hours didn't just pass. They vanished, much like she did. By mid-afternoon on May 24, 2004, Corvallis police officers had established a perimeter around Oak Park Apartments. Yellow tape sealed off a quiet sidewalk. A single bucket, a sponge, and 2 sandals were all that remained of a 19-year-old woman who had been cleaning light posts that morning, and then simply wasn't there. No visible blood, no forced entry, no security footage, no witnesses. What investigators had was absence. And in law enforcement, absence isn't nothing. It's the beginning of a different kind of forensic analysis. Behavioral patterning, scene subtraction, and most importantly, what's missing that should have been there. By hour 4, Brooke's family had confirmed she was not answering her cell phone. Her car, a green Honda, was still parked where she'd left it that morning. Her wallet and ID were at home. She had no boyfriend, no known medical conditions, no mental health concerns, no reason to disappear. Detectives began by recreating a minute-by-minute timeline. At approximately 9:45 a.m., Brooke was last seen by her sister. She had exited the apartment with her cleaning supplies and walked toward the outer courtyard. She intended to clean a set of lampposts that bordered the parking lot. She didn't carry a purse. She wasn't wearing headphones. It was a task she'd done before. By 11:55 a.m., she had not returned to the apartment. That's when the family called 911. Investigators determined the window of possible abduction was between 9:50 and 11:45 a.m., a span of nearly 2 hours, but narrowing it further was impossible. No surveillance, no witnesses, and no signal pings from her cell phone. The device had not made or received any calls that morning. It hadn't left a digital trail. At 2:30 p.m., K-9 units were deployed. A scent trail was located but terminated within 150 feet of the property's northern exit, the direction of a side street and a small parking lot. That zone was gravel, not pavement. No tire marks, no shoe prints, nothing photographable. One of the tracking dogs showed interest near the base of a lamppost, close to where the bucket had been recovered. That alert was recorded, but no further indicators emerged. The dog could not trail beyond the sidewalk. Weather conditions were clear, but hours had passed. Scent decay was a risk. That night, ground search teams were deployed across a 2-mile radius. They checked creek beds, green belts, abandoned sheds, and culverts. Nothing. No clothing, no discarded items, not even a torn glove or dropped receipt. Oak Park had no history of violent incidents. Background checks on current tenants revealed no red flags. No sex offenders lived on site. Property management confirmed no maintenance workers had been scheduled that morning, and still no leads. The following morning, police expanded their search zone. Volunteers began arriving by the dozens. Students from Oregon State, church members, local residents armed with flyers and boots combed through trails and parks. Detectives began compiling potential vehicles of interest. Several residents recalled a green Dodge Caravan parked along the curb earlier that morning. No plate was recorded. The make and model were consistent across 3 accounts, but no one had seen it leave. Aerial surveillance was deployed by state police. Over 14 square miles of rural and semi-urban land were mapped. No visual anomalies, no disturbed earth. Then, a man came forward, an apartment tenant, who said he noticed something off that morning. He heard a van door slam, not once, but twice. And what he remembered most, silence afterward. No voices, no footsteps, just silence. He hadn't thought to mention it before. He just assumed someone was moving or delivering something. That one statement became the first break, however minor. Detectives began evaluating known offenders in surrounding counties. Lists were pulled. Probation departments were contacted, but no persons of interest matched the vehicle description or time window. By day 3, the FBI was formally brought in. Not due to evidence of interstate crime, but due to the profile of the case, a stranger abduction with no forensic trace. Brooke's case now met criteria for federal assistance. Agents began parallel work, geographical profiling, past crime pattern overlays, and requesting records from car rental services within a 50-mile radius. A specialized behavioral analyst noted a troubling pattern. Whoever did this knew how to move fast. No scene, no sound. That points to someone who's done this before. Still, Without a body, without surveillance, and without digital breadcrumbs, it was a chess game in the dark. As the week closed out, search efforts grew, but momentum waned. New tips slowed, leads fell apart. The only thing consistent was the vacancy she left behind. Cases without physical evidence often bend under the weight of speculation. And when public pressure intensifies, law enforcement doesn't just chase leads, they chase plausibility. That's exactly what happened 10 days into the disappearance of Brooke Wilberger. By early June 2004, the FBI had established a task force with local police. Hundreds of tips had come in. Most were dismissed in minutes. But one caller mentioned a man recently arrested in Utah, a former Oregon resident with a disturbing criminal profile. His name was Sung-Koo Kim. At first glance, the link felt tenuous. Kim had never been to Corvallis in any documented capacity. But his arrest made headlines in Salt Lake City after officers found stolen women's underwear, over 3,000 items, carefully stored and labeled by campus and date. Some items were traced back to dormitories in Oregon and Washington. He had a documented history of prowling, voyeurism, and obsessive sexual behavior focused on college-aged women. When investigators pulled Kim's digital footprint, they discovered archived images of multiple Oregon college campuses saved to his hard drive, among them Oregon State University. And buried in one folder were yearbook-style portraits downloaded from public campus directories. One of them was Brooke Wilberger's. That was enough to move him from name to person of interest. Detectives secured a federal subpoena for Kim's internet activity. The recovered metadata showed he had accessed the OSU website in the weeks prior to Brooke's disappearance. More troubling was his travel log. Kim had registered for a hotel room in Salem, Oregon, roughly 45 minutes north of Corvallis, on May 23rd, just one day before Brooke vanished. Suddenly, a line had been drawn. The next move was procedural. Investigators flew to Utah, met with local police, and conducted a custodial interview with Kim. He was calm, polite, and immediately requested an attorney. The session ended quickly. But it didn't end interest in him. Investigators began backtracking all his travel records, purchases, and cell phone data. A search warrant for his vehicle turned up multiple pieces of clothing and a high-end camera with dozens of unprocessed rolls of film. The contents were disturbing. Zoomed-in images of women's dorm windows, parking lots at night, and students walking alone. While most photos couldn't be matched to individuals, some locations were unmistakable, Corvallis among them. The DA's office was briefed. A statement was prepared. Behind closed doors, there was real discussion about whether to charge Kim with involvement in Brooke's case. But then, a problem. Data from Kim's phone, analyzed by the FBI's digital forensics team, placed him south of Eugene, over 2 hours away, during the morning Brooke went missing. His hotel check-in in Salem had occurred, yes, but records showed he checked out early and drove to California the next day. Toll receipts, GPS pings, and gas station timestamps formed a solid alibi. He wasn't in Corvallis on May 24th. The development forced the team to pause. It also brought a sense of unease. One detective remarked in his report, "He didn't do it, but he could have, and that's almost worse." There was disappointment, but no regret in pursuing the lead. Kim was ultimately charged in Utah with dozens of counts related to theft, criminal trespass, and unlawful surveillance. But his connection to Brooke's case was ruled out. Still, the effect lingered. The community, already under stress, had been introduced to a face and a name. Media coverage had tilted toward guilt. Brooke's photo had appeared next to his mugshot in multiple outlets. Reversing that narrative wasn't easy. And worse, it meant the case was still open, with no real suspect in custody. The task force regrouped. Attention turned back to the green Dodge Caravan that had been spotted near the apartment complex. They had dismissed it once, unsure if it was relevant. Now it was the only viable lead left. Meanwhile, Brooke's family stayed silent in the media. They had chosen not to speak publicly about Kim. Their focus remained on the search, and the search by this point had grown cold, but not closed. There's a pattern in criminal investigations. The first false suspect is often followed by a long silence. Morale drops, public attention wanes, tips dry up. The pressure doesn't disappear, it just goes inward. And yet, buried in the silence, something else had started to surface. Hundreds of miles away, in another state, another young woman had just escaped an abduction attempt. The details, still incomplete, but the method, startlingly familiar. In the months following Brooke Wilberger's disappearance, the case stalled. Every forensic lead in Corvallis had been chased down, documented, or ruled out. The green Dodge Caravan spotted near Oak Park remained untraced, and the only solid suspect, Sung-Koo Kim, had been eliminated by hard data. By late 2004, the Wilberger Task Force was still technically active, but resources had been thinned and attention from national media had faded. The momentum was gone. But on November 30th, 2004, more than 6 months after Brooke vanished, an incident occurred nearly 1,200 miles away that would reopen the case. In Albuquerque, New Mexico, a 22-year-old foreign exchange student from Russia was abducted while walking near the University of New Mexico campus. The woman had just finished a late-night shift and was heading to her nearby apartment when she was approached by a man in a van. He offered assistance, then produced a knife. She was forced inside, assaulted, and driven to an abandoned parking structure. The victim survived. She escaped the vehicle when her abductor momentarily stepped away from the van door. She flagged down help from a passing car. Police arrived within minutes. The van and its driver were still nearby. The suspect was arrested at the scene. His name was Joel Patrick Courtney. At first, it was handled as a local case. Courtney was booked on charges of kidnapping, sexual assault, and attempted murder. But when detectives ran his name through NCIC databases, several alerts came back. He had a prior conviction for sexual assault in Oregon and was known to travel through the Pacific Northwest. FBI behavioral analysts had flagged him years earlier as a high-risk offender. His van, a green Dodge Caravan, was towed and impounded. Inside, investigators found personal items belonging to the Russian student, along with knives, duct tape, and gloves. And one small, seemingly unrelated detail, a gas receipt from Oregon, dated May 24, 2004, a date that was no longer unfamiliar. The receipt originated from a Chevron station in Corvallis. It was time-stamped 9:45 a.m. Investigators from New Mexico immediately notified the FBI's Portland field office. Within 72 hours, Courtney's name was added to the Wilberger case log. By December 6th, agents from the original Corvallis task force flew to Albuquerque to observe a formal interview with Joel Courtney. He was advised of his rights and declined to speak without an attorney. His legal representation prevented a full custodial interrogation. But the van, registered in Courtney's name, was now a priority for forensic processing. FBI crime scene techs from Quantico flew in to examine the vehicle under controlled lab conditions. The carpeted floor and interior upholstery were removed and tested. Several stains were discovered, some consistent with bodily fluids. Multiple long blonde hairs were found embedded in the passenger seat and floorboard. Samples were secured and rushed to the National DNA Database. The hair was not from the Russian victim. 3 days later, the results came back. Mitochondrial DNA analysis matched one of the samples to Brooke Wilberger. This was no coincidence. There was no legitimate explanation for a 19-year-old woman from Corvallis to leave her hair in a van parked in Albuquerque 6 months after she disappeared. For investigators, this was the first physical connection, after months of searching, that directly tied someone to Brooke. Meanwhile, a deeper dive into Joel Courtney's movements painted a troubling picture. Courtney had no stable address. He moved from state to state, lived out of hotels, and frequently paid in cash. His employment history was spotty, mostly short-term construction gigs. Background checks revealed a history of restraining orders, a known drinking problem, and repeated contact with women under suspicious circumstances. He had been in Oregon multiple times throughout 2004. His cell phone records placed him in the general Corvallis area the day Brooke went missing. Travel logs, receipts, and statements from former roommates confirmed his presence, but no one had thought to connect him before. Until now. A timeline was assembled. May 23rd, Joel purchases supplies in Eugene. May 24th, receipt in Corvallis. May 25th, credit card ping near Newport, Oregon. After that, his trail went cold until the November arrest in New Mexico. What stood out most to investigators wasn't just the presence of Brooke's DNA in Courtney's van. It was the fact that the van had not changed since May. The seat covers, the carpet, the structure. It had not been replaced or deep cleaned, and that allowed for trace evidence to survive. Technically, it wasn't enough to file charges for murder. There was still no body. But this was no longer a missing persons case in theory. It was, in practice, a homicide. And it had been 6 months. Back in Corvallis, Brooks' family was notified of the new development. For the first time, they had a name. A person. A link that didn't disappear under scrutiny, but there was still no certainty. Courtney had not confessed. He had not been indicted for Brooks' case. The justice system moved carefully, especially when the primary charge would be capital murder. Agents began mapping out the next phase. More interviews, more forensic reanalysis, and more pressure. The question was no longer whether Joel Courtney had been in Corvallis. It was what he had done and where he had left Brooke. May 2005. Albuquerque, New Mexico. Almost a year had passed since Brooke Wilberger vanished in Oregon without a trace. Despite extensive searches, media coverage, and federal assistance, the case remained stalled. But the investigation took a sudden and violent turn, not in Corvallis, but 1,400 miles away. This time, the victim survived. A 22-year-old foreign exchange student studying English in the U.S. contacted police after escaping a brutal attempted kidnapping in Albuquerque. She reported being assaulted in a parking lot near the University of New Mexico, forcibly shoved into a vehicle by a man wielding a knife, and driven to an unknown location. Over the course of several hours, she was restrained, assaulted, and threatened. But at the first opportunity, when her attacker left her momentarily unattended, she escaped barefoot into the street, flagging down a passing driver. The driver called 911 immediately. Local officers responded within minutes. The victim was transported to a nearby hospital. She had bruises around the wrists, defensive wounds on her arms, and ligature marks across her ankles. Medical examination preserved swabs and trace evidence. A rape kit was administered and stored for expedited testing. Her description of the attacker was clear, consistent, and precise. Tall, dark hair, scruffy beard, and a distinctive scar on his left forearm. The suspect vehicle was described as a green Dodge van. Investigators recovered a partial plate from a security camera at the university parking structure. DMV records linked it to a man named Joel Patrick Courtney. When officers arrived at Courtney's listed address, they found him passed out in the driver's seat of the van, unshaven, agitated, with visible scratches on his face. A search warrant was issued for the vehicle. Inside, officers found duct tape with blonde hairs adhered to it, a blood-stained towel, and a hunting knife tucked beneath the passenger seat. Investigators also noted a torn page from a road atlas open to the state of Oregon. Joel Courtney was arrested on May 29, 2005 for kidnapping, sexual assault, and attempted murder. His fingerprints matched prints lifted from the scene of the Albuquerque abduction. DNA analysis was expedited. One sample from the rape kit was a full match to Courtney. Meanwhile, the Oregon team working Brooke Wilberger's case was notified immediately. The name Joel Courtney had never come up in their investigation. But the news of a nearly identical abduction pattern, committed by a man with no known ties to the New Mexico victim, raised immediate red flags. Through FBI coordination, Courtney's movements were backtracked. The breakthrough came from cell tower records, subpoenaed in Oregon. Joel Courtney's phone pinged in Corvallis at 9:42 a.m. on May 24, 2004, the very date and morning Brooke went missing. His phone then went dark for several hours before reappearing near Eugene later that afternoon. That data point placed him within 2 miles of Oak Park Apartments at the exact window of Brooke's disappearance. In addition to the digital trail, Courtney's prior criminal record, previously sealed under a deferred prosecution agreement, was reopened. In 1999, he had been arrested for assaulting a woman in Portland, but the case was dismissed after the victim declined to testify. He had been under the radar ever since. Oregon State Police sent a forensics team to New Mexico. Courtney's van was flown back to Oregon under FBI custody for forensic comparison. A strand of long blonde hair, later confirmed via mitochondrial DNA to be Brooke Wilberger's, was recovered from under the floor mat. It had been overlooked in earlier processing. Luminol testing in the van revealed traces of blood that had been scrubbed but not completely erased. That single hair, along with the cell phone pings and prior presence in Oregon, changed the trajectory of the Wilberger investigation. Joel Courtney was now the prime suspect, not Sung-Koo Kim, not a serial underwear thief, but a violent predator with no clear pattern beyond opportunism. When confronted with the mounting evidence, Courtney remained silent. His public defender advised against speaking to law enforcement. But prosecutors in both states began strategizing. New Mexico wanted to proceed first due to the living victim. Oregon investigators understood, but they prepared anyway. The Wilberger family was notified of the new suspect. It wasn't the closure they had hoped for, but for the first time in over a year, there was a name, and a van, and a link. Something tangible, and if confirmed, perhaps soon. Answers. It's often the smallest trace that opens the biggest break. In the summer of 2009, nearly 5 years after Brooke Wilberger vanished without a trace from Oak Park Apartments in Corvallis, Oregon, a federal task force, quietly but methodically, began sifting through overlooked files, satellite imagery, and soil analysis reports. The Wilberger case was never truly cold. It remained quietly burning on the desks of a few committed agents who believed one detail had been missed. And they were right. Joel Courtney had already been convicted in New Mexico for the brutal 2005 kidnapping and attempted assault of a foreign exchange student. His DNA was now logged in CODIS. That data had already linked him to Brooke's disappearance through samples found on a piece of evidence seized from his van in 2005. One single hair, later confirmed through mitochondrial DNA testing to belong to Brooke. But no body had ever been found, and Courtney, up until this point, refused to talk. In August 2009, investigators returned to the van and evidence storage. A new round of luminol testing was ordered. It was routine, even procedural, but this time more advanced reagents were used. The rear floorboards revealed blood patterns too small for early kits to catch. Those samples, though degraded, were sent to the FBI's Quantico lab. Partial DNA again matched Brooke's profile. This was the second independent confirmation linking Courtney directly to her. But it wasn't enough. The real progress came from a map. Investigators obtained Courtney's cell phone tower pings from May 2004. At the time, cell tower triangulation was imprecise, but by overlaying his old cell activity with his known movements in New Mexico, where he had used similar patterns in his later assault, the FBI behavioral unit saw a disturbing consistency. He always drove victims at least 10 to 15 miles out of town, then turned onto service roads or unmarked logging trails, always near national forests. Always just far enough to delay discovery. Cross-referencing those behavioral profiles with Courtney's known movements around Corvallis in May 2004, a specific logging road stood out, Mill Creek Road, located exactly 12 miles west of Oak Park. That location had never been searched. Why? Because no one had reason to believe Brooke had been driven west. Joel had never confessed, until now. In September 2009, faced with the irrefutable DNA evidence and under pressure from Oregon prosecutors building a death penalty case, Joel Courtney's attorney requested a private negotiation. The deal was simple: full confession and body recovery in exchange for life in prison without the possibility of parole. No death penalty. The Wilberger family agreed. October 29, 2009, a day that would quietly end a 5-year nightmare. At precisely 9:47 a.m., Courtney led detectives and FBI agents through a damp forest west of Philomath, Oregon. The ground was uneven, marked by years of leaf rot and shallow erosion. He walked slowly as if counting steps. Then, without warning, he pointed at the base of a Douglas fir and said, "There." A forensics team marked the coordinates. Digging began. By noon, a partial human skull and several bones, consistent with a young adult female, were uncovered. Brooke's dental records confirmed the identity the next morning. Joel Courtney's confession was recorded in full. He detailed approaching Brooke under the pretense of a maintenance issue, using a box cutter and zip ties to force her into his van. He admitted she pleaded for her life. He also admitted she didn't know him, had never interacted with him, and was chosen at random. He raped her, killed her shortly after, and buried her in a shallow grave miles from any road. There was no connection, no motive, just opportunity and violence. But the case didn't close with his confession. In the weeks that followed, agents retraced Joel's movements on May 24, 2004. Surveillance camera analysis, though grainy, showed a white van leaving Oak Park around 10:15 a.m. A neighbor's dashcam picked up a blurry image of a driver matching Joel's build. Tire tracks near Mill Creek matched the van's tires from 2004. Brooke's wristwatch was found buried alongside her remains, still intact. The time had frozen. 11:07 a.m. This chapter in the case demonstrated the value of sustained, methodical investigation. A crime committed in 2004, ignored in some corners of public memory, was finally closed thanks to the convergence of forensic persistence, digital forensics, and profile-driven fieldwork. There was no triumph in the ending, just resolution. Brooke's body had been returned to her family, and Joel Courtney was never going to walk free again. When Joel Courtney agreed to speak with prosecutors in 2009, it wasn't out of remorse. It was leverage. After 5 years of silence, deflection, and violent behavior, Courtney finally decided to trade information for a deal. Life imprisonment without the possibility of parole in exchange for revealing the location of Brooke Wilberger's body. The Wilberger family, drained from 5 years of limbo, agreed. They wanted closure, even if it meant he would never face a death sentence. The confession was methodical, devoid of empathy. Investigators described Courtney's tone as mechanical, as if reading back the instructions to a crime he had rehearsed in his mind for years. His account provided the final horrifying timeline. On the morning of May 24, 2004, Joel Courtney had been driving through Corvallis. He had no destination. His intent was predatory. He noticed Brooke Wilberger cleaning light posts near Oak Park Apartments. She was alone. Her posture indicated no concern, no sense that someone was watching. He parked his vehicle across the lot and walked toward her under the guise of needing directions. When she turned her head, he pulled a knife, held it low, and ordered her into his green minivan. She didn't scream. Witnesses later told police they heard nothing unusual that morning. Courtney kept the engine running and drove west, away from Corvallis, into the wooded outskirts of Blodgett. Along the way, he stopped twice to ensure he wasn't being followed. He parked in a pullout just 12 miles from the abduction site. That's where he raped her. And when she resisted, scratched him, and tried to run, he struck her, silencing her permanently. He claimed the act was spontaneous, yet what followed indicated a pattern of practiced concealment. He wrapped Brooke's body in a blue tarp he had in the back of the van and dragged it deeper into the woods, burying her beneath branches and forest debris. The scene, described by investigators later, showed no signs of a burial, just concealment. It wasn't meant to preserve, it was meant to delay. Courtney then returned to Corvallis. Investigators now believe he attempted to abduct 2 other women that day. One confirmed she had seen a man matching Courtney's description trying to coax her into his van, but she fled. That was key. It confirmed his behavior wasn't isolated to Brooke. When Courtney described the location of Brooke's body in 2009, it matched the general area local and federal teams had previously searched, but they had missed it. In August 2009, investigators, accompanied by cadaver dogs and forensic teams, returned to Blodgett. This time, they found human remains, including a partial skull, dental records, and several personal items that matched those Brooke had been wearing. DNA tests would later confirm the identity. The forensic evidence, even after 5 years in the elements, was consistent with Courtney's account. Damage to the cranium was consistent with blunt force trauma. No defensive wounds were observable due to decomposition, but fibers from the tarp Courtney mentioned were still present near the site, confirming his narrative. Detectives also recovered buttons matching Brooke's last known outfit, something never released to the public. The full timeline at last was complete, and yet it left more questions than comfort. Courtney had lived freely for over a year after Brooke's death. He was only caught because of another failed abduction attempt in New Mexico. Had that victim not escaped, there's no telling how many more women could have been harmed. This chapter of the case wasn't just about confession. It was about systems catching up with a predator who had nearly disappeared into the cracks. The Wilberger family chose to forego the death penalty in favor of finally bringing their daughter home. They were allowed to lay Brooke to rest with dignity, but it was not justice. It was resolution of the coldest kind. In private conversations, federal agents involved in the case remarked that Courtney's calculated nature, his ability to blend in and strike at random, was precisely what made him dangerous. There were no emotional cues, no obvious pattern, just opportunity. It's a reality that challenges the public's assumptions about how predators behave. In this case, the monster wore a plain face and had no connection to his victim whatsoever. The conviction that closed a 5-year hunt. The courtroom reckoning that gave a grieving family something to bury. Truth. By mid-2009, the FBI had closed the forensic circle around Joel Patrick Courtney. With DNA from Brooke Wilberger confirmed on the interior fabric of his green 1990 Mazda, the same vehicle seen near the Oak Park complex on May 24, 2004, and with his own admission of guilt recorded in custody, the case transitioned into a judicial phase. There would be no trial. There would be no chance of him walking free. Courtney agreed to a plea deal in September 2009. In exchange for revealing the exact location of Brooke's remains and sparing her family the trauma of a trial, he would avoid the death penalty and accept a sentence of life in prison without parole. Prosecutors from Benton County, Oregon, coordinated with New Mexico authorities where Courtney had separately faced charges for the 2004 kidnapping and sexual assault of a foreign exchange student. The Wilberger family, after 5 years of uncertainty, accepted the deal. On September 21, 2009, Courtney led law enforcement to a wooded ravine near Mary's Peak, roughly 12 miles from the original abduction site. There, forensic teams recovered partial skeletal remains, along with clothing that matched what Brooke had last been seen wearing. A forensic anthropologist confirmed the identity by dental records. It was over. At sentencing in Corvallis, Oregon, Joel Courtney appeared in shackles. His statement was short. "I'm sorry for what I did." The courtroom remained silent except for the steady breathing of Brooke's father, Greg Wilberger, who had waited 1,944 days to hear that sentence finalized. On February 18, 2010, Joel Patrick Courtney was formally sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for aggravated murder, kidnapping, and sexual assault. He would remain in custody at the Oregon State Penitentiary, never to be released. The significance of the Wilberger case extended beyond the conviction of a single man. It underscored the quiet effectiveness of interstate cooperation between law enforcement agencies. Without the attempted abduction in New Mexico, without the vigilance of the woman who escaped and reported him, and without the establishment of a national DNA database, Joel Courtney may never have been linked to Brooke Wilberger's disappearance. The case also sparked policy discussions in Oregon regarding how missing adult cases were classified and handled. At the time of her disappearance, Brooke had been entered into missing persons databases, but not with the same urgency reserved for children under 18. Some states have since reconsidered how they respond to disappearances involving college-age women, especially those with no criminal history, known risks, or substance abuse concerns. Though no sentence could undo the damage, the resolution of this case offered clarity. Families of the missing often suffer not just from loss, but from the absence of a body, the vacuum of knowing. The Wilbergers were given answers. And in the world of unresolved disappearances, that alone is rare justice. After telling Brooke's story, one truth stands tall. Evil doesn't always come from shadows. It can appear in broad daylight, in familiar neighborhoods, targeting people just like you and me. What happened to Brooke reminds us that we must stay vigilant, value every moment, and protect one another as a community. As someone who's walked you through this journey, I urge you, never take safety for granted. And never forget the power of one voice, one witness, one breakthrough. If this story touched you, let me know where you're watching from, or what part of Brooke's case impacted you the most. And if it didn't sit right, tell me why. I'm here to listen. If you found value in this video, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story. Let's keep these conversations going.